Welcome to this, the last of our Veritas series lectures for this year. It's been a good year. We begin by acknowledging that our campus at King's University College is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawabaron peoples, all of whom have long-standing relationships to the land of southwestern Ontario and to the City of London. The First Nations communities of our local area include Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nations. In our region, there are 11 First Nations communities, as well as a growing Indigenous urban population. So we are very pleased that you've joined us for this evening's lecture. My name is Jim Pancho. I'm the coordinator of the Veritas series and pastoral counselor here at King's, and it's part of the campus ministry team. One little business point, although we offer our lectures free of charge, you notice when you came in that there's a little donation box. Please do avail yourself of the free will donation. It goes to support refugee initiatives that we've undertaken here at King's. So tonight, it's my great pleasure to welcome our local hero, I'll just say Dr. Benjamin Muller. Dr. Muller holds a PhD in international studies from Queen's University, not the Queen's University, but from Belfast. He's the author of multiple peer-reviewed books, articles, and chapters on issues related to borders, sovereignty, technology, and identity. Dr. Muller has served as an invited expert to NATO, Interpol, and the World Customs Organization, the European Science Foundation, and the Parliament of Canada. He has served on boards as president of various academic and professional associations, has held visiting fellowships at a number of universities in Canada, the US, and Turkey, and continues to serve as president of King's University College Faculty Association. Tonight, Dr. Muller is going to present on the topic of walls, security, and the sacred. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Muller.
So hopefully, well, sounds like the mic is working, or isn't it working? Yeah, it's working. Thumbs up. Because I know myself enough to know that in spite of making a script, I will likely not follow it. I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey. So first of all, the title, I'm an academic, so when I give a title any further than 3 weeks ahead, it's going to change once I get to the actual event. And this was a lot longer than 3 weeks ago that I was asked to think about what I'm going to talk to you tonight. And one of the reasons that it changed is because there were some events that changed in my life. And that was having this opportunity to take students to the borderlands of the US and Mexico. And so partly I'm going to talk about that tonight. And I'm going to put it into a bit of a context because unlike those students, you didn't all have the opportunity to also be in that course. So a little bit's going to be kind of biographical, so there are some of the students here, so apologies for that. It's going to be like repeat because you know me well after sharing time with me. But hopefully that gives you a sense of why I'm interested in walls and borders and the things that I am. And the other side of this is, something that happens at King's a lot is we talk about what is our mission statement. What are we as a liberal arts Catholic college? And what does that mean to a pretty diverse population? And I thought maybe a good example is actually this course, because there's an extent to which this course is about approaching some really difficult issues, some crises, some injustices, humanitarian problems, with the idea of what could we do to try and make those things better? How can we intervene? How can we understand those issues better? Which I think is actually a very good example of doing precisely what we say we do here at King's. So I'm going to start with a bit of background about me. So sort of why am I standing here, I suppose, is the, in a very long-term sense. And that's due to my interest, to be honest, in the fall of the Berlin Wall. I was going to talk about how old I was when that happened, but in conversations, with Father Michael earlier. I realized that that might offend some people and make others laugh or whatever, so I'll just leave that. I was at a point in my life where I was somewhat politically conscious, let's put it that way, but not maybe as conscious as others that I know. So when that happened, there's a variety of issues. First of all, my family immigrated from Germany after the Second World War as refugees, and part of my family was split on either side of that wall. And I grew up hearing a lot of stories about that. And when we went back to visit when I was younger, we weren't able to visit some of the family because of that. And so when that wall came down, it had a really huge effect on me. And I kind of bought into the feelings at that time that the world was a different place. And part of what struck me as amazing was that for, in some ways, a relatively short period of time, people grew apart from one another in a variety of ways, purely because of the imposition of a political line. Now, granted, it was also a physical border, but it was approximately 30 to 40 years that you had that line, and that was there to kind of erase a much longer history of familial interactions, intermarriages, social connections, and so on. And so I was already wondering, how is that possible? And as I got older, I started to look into this a bit more and realized that there were actually really deep divisions that were created by that wall that didn't jive with the kind of lived experience of people over a much greater length of time. And if I would think there's one kind of core theme to all the research that I've done, it has to do with the ways in which the actions of states and policymakers and so on sometimes directly contradict or try and contradict the daily lived experiences of people. And borders are probably where that happens most obviously. And I think we continue to see that today, in spite of the fact that after the wall came down, there was a lot of conversations about a borderless world. And it turns out that that didn't quite happen. So, that was kind of always in the back of my mind. I went to university, I did my bachelor degree and master's degree at UVic, not a place that's really very walled, but a place that is actually, interestingly, a kind of border space, because it's below the Canadian border, it's below the 49th parallel. And so kind of daily life, you experience a lot of what you would experience in border towns. And then I went to do my PhD, and I chose another place with walls. I went to Northern Ireland, so the mural there was fairly close to where I lived. I didn't happily live that close to the so-called Peace Wall that ran through North Belfast, but it was a very interesting place to be a part of a society that was trying to negotiate deep divisions, and part of the way that it was doing that was by building walls, literally, physically building walls. So since the peace agreement in 1998, where there was a movement to disarm the groups, the Unionist Protestant groups and the Irish Republican groups, there was actually a proliferation of walls. So the kind of like good fences make good neighbors, they sort of took that to the extreme within that period and built a lot of these walls. And I mean, the heights of the walls were literally so people couldn't throw flaming things over them. Really very practical, very straightforward, simplistic. But in spite of the fact that those walls were there, those physical walls, they had gates in them. And one of the ways you could tell that things were kind of going well was that the gates were left open. Sometimes they were closed in the evening, sometimes they even stayed open at night. So there was, again, a very clear idea that there was a symbolic nature to these walls, but it wasn't really about dividing communities in I think, the way that we think borders might be. It was more about telling a kind of story. It was about trying to tell people about where they belonged and where they didn't belong, and who they ought to be with and who they ought not to be with. And increasingly, as I sort of have gone on, I feel like that's the important story, that borders are trying to tell a story that often contradicts the sorts of stories that those who are far away from borders want us to believe. So when I went to Belfast, I actually knew nothing about the place. Did not study anything to do with Irish history. I was mildly interested in the so-called troubles that happened there and so on, but no real idea. So I accept to do my PhD there, and all of a sudden, family members, friends are like, are you crazy? Why are you going to move to Belfast? Don't you ever watch the news? What's wrong with you? And I had a friend in graduate school who said he grew up in communist Poland and then fled after the Solidarity movement in the early 1980s. And he said, things always look worse from far away. And that's been a kind of mantra, in a way, for me, to say that you don't really understand things until you get in there, till you get deep down and get on the ground and actually see what's going on. And the story I'm going to tell tonight is a precise story about that. I think it's one that we're all familiar with, the faraway story, because we hear it almost daily. But getting to the place and realizing that actually things are very different and look very much worse from far away than they do from close up. So that was a really, incidentally, he also introduced my wife and I to each other, so that could be another reason we kind of stay in touch in some way. So I'm going to talk mostly tonight about what are called the Sonoran Borderlands. So the borderlands that follow the Sonoran Desert in the southwestern United States, predominantly Arizona and the state of Sonora, Mexico. So I have this image right now of the San Javier mission up here. And I like to use this image as, to me, the quintessential depiction of the borderlands. Now, people probably would expect to see a fence, a wall, a port of entry, something like that. But I think that's precisely the vision of the border from far away that we're often given that's actually very misleading. Whereas this kind of border space tells us the complexity, the kind of troubled story where all these kinds of lines that the border's trying to draw in really clean ways don't make any sense. So this building was built in the early part of the 1700s, part of Spanish colonialism and Catholic missionaries, Jesuits. And so that's an important part of its history. But immediately, already at that point, there was direct engagement with the indigenous population there who were participants in the construction of this building. So already we have kind of communities interacting in a way, not dividing, but actually interacting. It's also in a space that for thousands of years has been a trade route. And there's all sorts of archaeological sites around that to highlight the way in which this has been a long-held route, not a place where people have been limited, but in fact where there's been tons and tons of mobility. Now, I don't know how clear everybody is with history of the United States and of Mexico, so I'm going to skip a couple slides here and then I'll go back. So this is a map from the mid part of the 19th century. So the Mexican border was a little bit further up than it is now. In fact, Mexico was about double its size. Mid part of the 19th century, not the 4th century. So it's not that long ago. And this border had a certain amount of fluidity going on throughout the 19th century. So moved back due to Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, and particularly in the mid part, 1848, things like the Gadsden Purchase, led to where we now recognize the border. San Javier Mission is on a site that was precisely where all those transitions took place. So it's Mexican space, it's Spanish space, it's American space, it's indigenous space, and it continues to inhabit that kind of space. It's actually currently on part of the Tohono O'odham Reservation, and is actually very well attended by members of the community in Tucson and members of the Tohono O'odham Nation as well, and members from the south of Tucson. So it continues to be this kind of gathering place that to me is a much more apt description of what's going on at the border. There's a lot of intermixing, a lot of crossovers, a lot of kind of messiness, if you will, in terms of identities. Now I have to go back the other way because this is, this is how my mind works. So this is this kind of key site. But of course, as you know, if you were to turn the news on today and think about what's going on at the Mexico-US border, it's unlikely that this would be the image that you would see on CNN. It's probably not the kind of image that's being depicted. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So one of the things is, why after these other experiences of walls and borders do I become interested in this? Well, Arizona is a kind of exceptional space, for sure. As much as it has this kind of complexity and messiness in terms of identity historically, there's also a lot of attempts by the state to try and assert a different story, to not celebrate the kind of story that we see at the mission in terms of these interconnections and overlaps, but actually to kind of conceal that, to not show things like the map from prior to 1848, but actually hide that. And there's actually bizarre things that have happened in terms of legislation in Arizona in order to promote that. So I've got a couple of them up there. I mean, House Bill 2281 was kind of crazy. In 2010, it was rendered illegal to teach ethnic studies. So, we talk about this potential assault on education going on in our own province. Well, this is a whole other level of assault, where you effectively say telling the kinds of stories that a place like San Javier Mission tells us is actually something that's going to be illegal or simply not going to allow. So that's a really kind of crazy idea in my mind. Pair that up with things like Senate Bill 1070, which actually allows local policing authorities to do the kinds of things that we would all be familiar with when we crossed a border with border police, asking us questions about why we're there, where we're going, do we have papers, all these kinds of things, which we don't find strange when we're at the border. I mean, we might not enjoy it, but we kind of expect it. But we may not expect it walking down the street in London. And so that's what this bill allowed for. Now, for a variety of reasons, the Supreme Court struck these down. Nevertheless, they were attempts by the state to kind of assert its power to say, we want to tell a different story. We don't want this other story getting out about these coexistence, these messy identities, this history. We want to really assert something else. Again, they didn't pass, though. They failed. I bring this New York Times article from just a couple of days ago. There was a protest at a talk on the University of Arizona campus where border guards were speaking, and those protesting, there was a kind of threat that they would be charged with criminal actions. So this is ongoing. It's not stopping. And it's really serious. So none of this, as much as like there's things we might talk about in a kind of academic way and intellectualize it, it's very serious and it actually affects real people in really deep ways. And sort of that's where the story goes from here. So this is probably something more along the lines of the vision of the border you're imagining. So unfortunately, and I'll say this, unfortunately, I'll wear this on my sleeve and feel safe about it, the United States President Trump was elected in 2016. And so as a result of that unfortunate incident, we have this. So this is in San Diego. So Mr. Trump, among his promises for election was that he was going to build a wall along the border. Well, first point is there is, of course, a wall across much of the border already. But he put out for tender a variety of contractors to produce different walls. And so in San Diego, there were these mock-ups of walls. So it's more of a symbolic image in a sense, because none of these have actually gone forward, and they've demolished the mock-ups, in fact, by now already. But this is, again, very much trying to promote a logic that says, we know the rhetoric, we hear this, that there's threats on the other side. It's not about the ways in which these histories are interconnected. It's not about the ways in which families live on both sides of the border, that there's mobility that's been here for thousands of years, none of that. And one of the effective ways to do that is symbolically. I think everyone recognizes you actually don't truly stop movement, but symbolically you can cause ruptures within communities. I like to put this image up when I teach the course, and it's nice to kind of contrast it with the previous image. So the previous image is the result of a president's decree to build a wall on the border. This is Pat Nixon, First Lady of the United States, President Nixon, at the border San Diego and Tijuana in 1971. And her statement when this barbed wire fence was erected was, I hope this fence doesn't last for long. A Republican president, the wife of a Republican president, making a statement like that in 1971. So again, not 1671, 1971. So it's not that long ago that the notion of dividing these communities was, even for a Republican president, considered an unsavory idea. And I think, again, I like to remind people of that. There's not something that's permanent or timeless about this. It's very new, and it's something that is very intentional. It's not accidental. It's not as if there are not other options. There are many ways to deal with the situation that exists along that border. Because the other map is somewhat unclear, I like to put this map up for a couple of reasons. So again, it shows you a different border. This advertising campaign by Absolut Vodka was not used in the United States, potentially unsurprisingly. It was used in Mexico, but they pretty shortly after releasing the ad removed it under pressure from the United States in 2008. So again, not that long ago, that even the notion of showing this was something that we simply couldn't look at, even in an advertisement for a product. And so, the story goes on in terms of none of this thus far, to an extent, with the exception of the mission, is about what's actually happening. Much more of it is about imagery, theater, visions, about what we want to say about who should be together, who shouldn't be, and a kind of alleged problems, if you will. Now, we're at King's. We helped write this. We sit in meetings and look at our own mission, but I thought I'd put it up here because after those meetings, most of us don't look at it. Well, at least I'll admit, I don't look at it outside of those meetings all that much. But I put it here so the course of lectures this year were a lot of people coming in talking about fabulous things that they're doing to bring conversations about peace and understanding, dealing with deeply divided societies, and so on. And I put this up here and wanted to talk about the trip to Arizona to highlight that those things are also happening here. And that's the kind of great honor and privilege I have, and why I'm really thankful to be doing this, because, even when I walked in, Leo from Communications says, "Have you done one of these before?" And I said, "Not at my own institution." We tend to always, it's the little bit prophets never as liked in their own lands kind of issue. So we never tend to do that in our own space. So I thought, here's an opportunity, not to belittle what's going on anywhere else, but that there's some pretty amazing things going on right here. And the things I want to highlight, first of all, it says, knowledge in the service to humanity. So right in our statement, it's the idea, this isn't just for nothing. This is actually to serve, to actually help in some way. And the other is the final point, articulate expression, creativity, and ethical action. It's in our mission. There's nothing wrong with us saying it in classrooms. There's nothing wrong with us doing it in our research. And to me, what better than viewing what's going on at the southern border and say, we need some ethical action here. We need to have a better understanding of what's going on. So one year I taught the course here at King's in a classroom with books. It was fine, but the whole time I was sitting there thinking, I just wish I could take people there. We'd read something and I'd say, it's fine, it's a good reading, but it's just not the same as if you could be there and see what's going on and smell it and see the desert and all those kinds of things. So as much as I will openly admit I a little bit went into experiential learning, kicking and screaming, once I went in, I kind of jumped in fully and realized that it's pretty awesome. And I'll tell you part of the reason why it's awesome in a moment. So I never get to use cool stuff like this, so I'm going to use it. So a couple points. Can you still hear me? Is this still clicking on? Okay. I'm loud anyways. So we were in Tucson for most of our trip. So 14 students and a colleague of mine, Dr. Derek Silva, So we had a variety of sessions before to prepare students. We did some readings about the background, about the border in the southern U.S. We read a fabulous book by Luis Uria called The Devil's Highway, which I would highly recommend. If you read one thing about the southern border, read that. We read that, and then off we went on February reading week. So we, for various reasons, flew to Phoenix, and then we were in Tucson. So I'm going to, try and keep this in your mind. I can't keep the map up here the whole time when we're going through our various stages, but among the things that we did while we were there, which I'll talk about in a little more detail, we went to Nogales, both the American and Mexican side. So it's a city that's literally scarred. It's cut in half by the wall that predates Mr. Trump by quite a long time. We spent a day on the Tana Autumn Reservation. Part of the reservation lands actually go down here into Mexico, into Sonora. That reservation, just to give you a sense of space, is approximately the size of Connecticut. So I think it's the second largest reservation in the United States. We spent some time in cells, and then we went down to the border, and you'll see some photos of that. So we kind of saw this corridor a bit, and we're over here, and spent a fair bit of time in Tucson. Yes?
Where's that mission that you showed?
The mission was just over here. So where these lands come out, so it's like maybe 40 minutes from Tucson, approximately. Very visible because it's the white building in the desert. You can see it from quite a distance. It was one of the first in terms of the missions then moved from here out to California and up. So Father Kino, who was the Jesuit who set that up, was, first of all, very well liked, particularly among the indigenous peoples, and then moved up the Baja. He was actually the person that, quote unquote, discovered that the Baja Peninsula was a peninsula and not an island. So feel free, by the way, to put your hand up. I'm used to it. I teach. All right, so I'm going to kind of take you day by day through our trip. It's a little bit like your uncle showing you a slideshow. I didn't have an uncle like that, and I'm currently not an uncle like that, so I'm taking this opportunity. It's a little like one could say it's, I have an audience, so, here I go. So the first day we were there, obviously this was planned out and it was all very specific. One of the key things to understand this borderland in terms of its culture, in terms of its history, in terms of contemporary political issues, socioeconomic ones, is the actual geography. It's a pretty amazing place, but also a place that deserves your respect. The Sonoran Desert is, through policies by the US government, is actually named in their documents as a deterrent to migration. So they've basically said, we know if we do A, B, and C, people will have to go out in the Sonoran Desert, and nobody would really want to do that, so that kind of does some of the work for us. Now, we'll talk a little later, and I'm happy to answer questions, but part of the ramifications of that are, of course, death. Death comes in the desert relatively quickly. There's no tricks about eating certain kinds of plants to get liquid or anything. There is actually just no water, so you quickly expire as a result. And so since 1994 to about 2011, the figures are roughly 6,000 deaths in the desert. And the predominant number of those are in what's called the Tucson sector. It's listed by the Customs and Border Patrol, which is the area we were in. So this is us at the Desert Museum. So this place is basically, it's not really a museum as such. You're outside, you're learning about the plants, the animals. I wanted students to obviously experience all that, but I was kind of concerned that they would touch things they shouldn't touch for the rest of the trip. So I thought immediately you need to know, yes, that is as sharp as it looks. Yes, there are scorpions, all these kinds of things. So we learned all about that there. Great day, great first day. When I look at it now, it seems like how could that have been the first day? That in my mind already felt like day 4 or something. So, a couple things about this slide. First point is the one image I was asked to put that up by Father Béchard. My colleague, Dr. Silva, who came with us, took the photo of me geared up for the rodeo, which we went to. We were there during the Tucson Rodeo. The Tucson Rodeo has been running since 1925. It's actually historically very steeped in Mexican culture, the vaqueros. And actually the first poster ever created said, "Please don't shoot up our town," the first poster they had. So, I mean, we were just lucky that we happened to be there while it was going on. For many years, it was a school holiday in Tucson. Some schools still observe that as a holiday. And it's an important piece in the kind of cultural mosaic that makes up that borderland space. And I think it was, I mean, many of the students had not been to a rodeo, so that was, something in and of itself. But also seeing the ways in which both a kind of very open American nationalism operates in that space, and also the ways in which we see various peoples from the community, Hispanic and not, interacting in that space. There was also a few military recruiting setups there that the students found very interesting, which again, we probably wouldn't be seeing as much in our own context. So it was a good kind of acclimatizing to the space, and as you can see, people did. They kind of jumped right in to that. So that was a great day, a lot of fun, not as kind of heavy maybe. So the next, one of the challenges of experiential learning is you're doing a lot of stuff. Like you're seeing things pretty well all the time. Everything's new, potentially. And so you need time to reflect, you need time to talk. And that's something that we tried to build in as much as we could. And this was just so we had a day after kind of a couple full days where we were spending the whole days out and seeing things. We had a bit of a freer day. This is the Mercado St Augustine on the right-hand side. So this is in an area of the city called Menlo Park, which is one of the oldest parts of the city, a predominantly Hispanic part of the city. About 6 blocks or so from there are actually archaeological sites from thousands of years ago. So this, again, area has been traversed by peoples for a very, very long time. This is on the University of Arizona, on the left. That's called Border Dynamics. It's a piece of artwork. I think the first time I may have been there, my colleague said, "Find the border on the campus." And, because it is basic. I mean, the border wall in parts are actually made of pieces of steel just like that. But the campus is also very much ensconced in the borderlands and the discussions about it in terms of their student population and so on. And I'll get to that as well. We'll see a bit more of that. So the next day we did what everybody would expect. We went and saw the real thing. The first thing I'll say is, I've been down here a few times and seen this. The first time you see it is rather shocking to see the wall. There is something different now. That razor wire isn't just for looks. It actually has a kind of psychological impact. It certainly doesn't have a security impact because people weren't going over it in urban spaces anyways. So that's not really changed. But what people did do a lot, and I don't know how easily you can tell, this part of the wall has gaps in it. And because it's in an urban space, people would go up to the wall and talk to each other. They would you'd often see someone take a 5-gallon pail, flip it over, sit on it, be having a chat, pass things through. None of that can happen anymore. So again, that's, when we talk about security, that's not really about security. That goes back to that we're trying to reinforce a story about divided communities here, about saying that you shouldn't be talking to each other to an extent, which is something different than saying that there's a security problem. The kind of vastness of it all, I think I would say the students felt it was pretty heavy for us to experience that, but it was obviously crucial to see. I also have to kind of name these people. So Nadia Alvarez, Justin Dutram, and Javier Duran. So they are our partners at the University of Arizona, and part of our trip couldn't happen without them. So this particular day, they were our guides. They allowed us to do things that certainly I couldn't have made happen. because of their connections. So that really made an exceptional day, and the students were able to get to know them, and it was really, really fabulous. So we did a few other things. We didn't just sit at the border. We actually went across. Before crossing, we stopped at a produce distribution company, so a place that brings in a lot of the produce from Mexico and ends up shipping it all over, including here. So in fact, I think it was Dr. Silva who found like a squash or something in a store here that had actually gone through the facility we were at. And so, you know, the students were always studious. That's like, I have thousands of pictures like this of them just sitting and writing, and like they were just so into it. So I thought, you know, always pensive, like it was just no fun. It was all work. But there, I mean, it was fascinating. So that was about like the food chain. Like, where does our food come from? And I mean, in Canada, we're obviously not growing these things now. So it's coming up from there. That was great. Then we saw the border. Then we crossed the border, and we went to an assembly plant on the Mexican side. That's part of the kind of NAFTA zone. Before doing that, of course, because we wanted to do that, we had to get work visas in Mexico, because you can't actually go into the NAFTA zone without getting a work visa. So, you know, my colleague Justin Dutram down there, he said, it's super easy. Go online, fill out these forms. Everything works beautifully. You just get there to the form and they stamp it. So that's absolutely not what happened. He said it happened every time he's taken a group, but not for us. No, we got to experience like inefficient, unhappy bureaucracy at its finest. So we're all like standing outside the port of entry facility in Mexico. We're having to go in small groups. There's no like, can we start process 2 because those people have finished process 1? Like, no. People are finishing, then we're starting with the next group. So that kind of put us behind a bit, but it was part of the experience. Because the interesting part is, had we not done that, we wouldn't have experienced anything at the border. We would have literally just driven in. And we kind of had to remind the students of that. On one side, there's razor wire, but when you cross, it's actually nothing. There was a green light, and we just went. And it's only because we wanted to do these other things that we needed to go into the port of entry. And somehow, like, everything was fine. This notion the border was operating in a radically different way. And the students commented, they're like, it looks like a war zone over there. They're talking about the US. So they weren't talking about the Mexican side. They were saying back on the US, it looked like a war zone. There's National Guard, there's razor wire. Mexican side, not. Border's fine. People painting it, people selling stuff in front of it. A very different image. So we went to that. We got to see, you know, people working in the free trade zone. It didn't look like a sweatshop from a film from the 1970s. So that shocked people a little bit. But I think they would all probably say they wouldn't want to work there. So you can make your judgment about what you think it was like. So we did that. We also went to the College of the Northern Frontier and talked to some professors there about their research, about particularly a lot of it was ecological research. It's one of the big things in the border region, in a desert region, is water. And the water, unfortunately, flows in ways that ignore the wall and ignore the border. And so where good water goes, where sewage goes, that's not completely controllable all the time according to the border. Now, of course, everybody wants the good water and nobody wants the sewage, so you can imagine what happens in terms of where things flow. And that was a big part of our conversation that day. And I mean, it was also great just to connect with people at a university there, to realize like they had classrooms, it wasn't like watching a scene from Sicario. Now, the next day, we had a fabulous opportunity. We were invited to spend the day on the Tona Autumn Reservation, which I showed on the map earlier. We drove out on a bus and spent the day with primarily a group of women kind of led us through that day who have organized a group called Indivisible Tucson. And this group is all basically about trying to push back against not the border wall in and of itself, but what it stands for. Pushing back against the divisiveness of those kind of politics. saying that's not what we want to be about. These are really amazing people, and we really felt like we were invited into someone's home that day. You can see there, so we got to walk along the border on their land. So there is a border fence right on their land. There's gates, but those gates have now been sealed shut. So historically, people with status cards were able to cross on their own land, but that's no longer possible. They cooked lunch for us. I'll never forget, we're sitting in their district office. They cooked a traditional meal for us, and then turned and looked at the group of students and said, "Who's going to pray for the food?" Now, I think the students, A, were kind of like, "Oh, I didn't know I'm going to have to do this on this trip." But B, I don't think they expected to hear that on an indigenous reservation. And it caused, again, some interesting questions about the kinds of lines between identities that walls and borders make us think about actually aren't what's happening. That people have worked out some very complex ways in which they've managed these identities. And so, yeah, some of them go to church, some of them also practice a variety of their traditional beliefs and so on, and they manage all of that together. The other thing I have to say is one of the students just barely skipped a beat and said, "Yeah, I'll do it," which impressed me. The students impressed me every day of this trip. The next day we were back in Tucson, and again the University of Arizona was kind of our host. And something they did that morning is they took us to the Mexican Consulate. Now, I don't know how many people here have been to a consulate around the world. Generally kind of boring places, really. Like, need a passport. I mean, not boring if you're being chased by rebels and the country you're in is starting to collapse, then a really good place to be. But aside from that, just sort of boring places. So in my mind, I'm like, that's great. We can go to the Mexican Consulate. I don't know how exciting it's going to be. Well, the first point is our guide, who was the kind of second in command, the vice consul, he was incredible. Students are always coming to our office saying, how do I get a job for the UN? How do I, get these incredible positions in global politics like this? And I said, you have to be like that guy. In his third language, he's telling subtle jokes. That's impressive. And then, somebody turns and says, well, what about that gallery? And he launches into a lecture about the history of Mexican art. That's who gets those jobs. He was just an absolutely incredible person. But the other thing, there are two kind of different things going on at the Mexican consulate that you wouldn't find in most consulates. The first is there's a call center for the entire U.S. that ends up being used by many Spanish-speaking peoples, not only Mexican citizens. And they often get calls from people who basically say, I don't know where I am, I'm lost in the desert, can you help me? And so they have to deal with those things. And it's been they perceive it as a huge success to have this call center. So that's a kind of good news story that's going on in the consulate. The other is, I think in the end, a good news story, but it's a tough story. So in the basement, they also have they have a couple people who visit prisons on a daily basis because of the high number of citizens who are incarcerated due to being captured while they're trying to cross. And the other is someone who works in forensics. Because a lot of people die in the desert, and their remains, we have to figure out who were they with, where are their family members, these sorts of things. And so there's someone who does that full time and had some maps to show us that were striking. And I toyed with the idea of having one of those maps up, but I decided against it. I just think they're a bit heavy. Plotting on maps where you found bodies, and when you see those maps, it's a lot to take in. But those things are going on in the consulate there, so I think it was incredibly eye-opening and fascinating for the students. And then the students got to mix with students, which, what did they like the most? Hanging out with each other. And so the University of Arizona set up situations for us where they could be talking with students who are there from Mexico, who are not coming to the United States because they're claiming asylum, who were not captured in the desert, who are not related to drug lords, but actually are basically on prestigious scholarships and have chosen to go to the University of Arizona, because that also happens. Because migration's a really complex story, and it's not just about, you know, people running from really bad situations, but there's a whole bunch of things going on. And that was also great. Just seeing these kind of free, open conversations going on was, you know, probably a really great way, because at that point in the trip, the students knew the right, I mean, at each point in time, they knew the right questions to ask. But by this time, they knew the kinds of things to ask students from there, students who had migrated from Mexico. So it was really fabulous to kind of witness that growth along the time. So I'm going to conclude. I haven't been paying attention to time. I don't, so I don't know if I'm early or late. But I'm just going to round out with a few things in the end here. The first thing is probably, there's a lot of the students here, I'll single them out after, but something that came up everywhere we went was people like almost grabbed us and said, "There's no crisis here." Like, it was a constant theme. And to me, reminded me of my friend saying, "Things always look worse from far away." So it's pretty easy to convince someone thousands of miles away that there's a crisis, but there, they wanted to tell us there's no crisis here. There was a young woman who's the age of our students who spent a significant part of the day with us when we were on the Tona Autumn Reservation. And she said, "Don't leave this place and tell a story about how dire things are on the reservation, how terrible the conditions are, how, you know, hopeless everything is. Actually tell the story that things are good. We're doing well. We're, of course, like everybody, we're struggling. There's battles. We have this stupid border here that we're trying to deal with and the politics that surround it, but we're actually doing well." And that was this predominant theme that came out. It came out when you got in a taxi. It came out when we had organized trips. You know, when you go to the Mexican consulate, you don't feel like, wow, like this is kind of like an under siege place. No, it actually was in some ways a model of efficiency. It's incredible. People can actually walk in there in the morning and get a passport in the afternoon. We all laughed. We're like, yeah, I don't think that's possible in Canada. So that was a big part of it. The other part of it is, of course, like, if we're going to tell a story about Kings and talk about the mission and talk about me and my colleague, Dr. Silva, taking students somewhere, there's a really key part of that, and that's the students. They're gonna, because you're here, I'm going to get all like choked up about this. I'll try not to. But, I mean, honestly, that's what makes these things, right? Is the willingness to engage and to just be so open. Because, what else is a wall doing other than it's about closure? It's about stopping connection. And our students were constantly open. We're constantly asking the right questions at the right time, at the right places, and willing to really take it all in. And you could see growth. We didn't have to say, you know what, tomorrow we need to have a debrief and talk about these things. The students said, we need to have a debrief and talk about these things. We need to converse. I want to chat about this. This was a heavy day. I need to kind of work these things out. And that's, who could want anything more? And I think if there's a story to be told about doing this, about kind of taking that knowledge and that ethical responsibility, that's sort of, to me, the big part of that. And it's the greatest shot ever. All right. I'm happy to take as many questions as you have.
So just for the sake of the recording, we can pass mics around to people, but please feel free. We have lots of time for questions. We'll end at 9 no matter what happens, so we'll go from there. But we've got about 40 minutes still. Yeah. So anybody? There's a mic at the back as well. But
It's not a planned question, but yeah.
So for future trips, because I'm assuming you're planning on doing this for further years, and I hope you do, is there anything you would particularly change, add, or remove?
Yeah, as a student who was on the trip, great question. So, I mean, one of the things is that I felt like it was still a bit compressed. We had to do a lot in the week's time, and so partly in conversation with the folks in Arizona, because if we went at a time outside of term, we'd be able to stay in residence, so the costs would be reduced, and it would give us the ability to be there a little bit longer. And so in terms of adding things, I mean, there's probably not too much I would add. I mean, Derek and I have talked about a couple things, but generally it's just that you could space it out a little more. Maybe some of the things we'd have a bit more time to do. But aside from that, I mean, no. Like, you know, having like been there many times but never done this with students, I was 100% like expecting something's gonna go wrong. Like I had it like, okay, when this, like that day that I planned this way completely doesn't work, what's plan B? I was completely prepared for that, and that never happened, which that sort of left me in shock. So in that way, like I couldn't imagine it really going better.
Hello. I was wondering from your family experience in divided Germany, when you said the people grew apart, was there any particular part of life or any particular, way that they grew apart? And do we see that in the U.S.-Mexican experience, or is the closed border too recent to unpack that?
That's an excellent question. So, I mean, the first point is, I know like there was in Germany, for example, the whole Westies and Ossies thing, right? I mean, there were ways in which people from the former East Germany would act in a store that immediately made them noticeable. And, because they were not used to, for example, having access to the kinds of products that were there. And, in the short term, I think particularly because the way in which there was a kind of redistribution of finances going on, there was some animosities. And that led to kind of more differences than maybe culturally there were. In this case, so for example, I'll give you an example on the trip. We were on the reservation and asked, this border is very arbitrary, it runs through your lands, how do you perceive the people on the other side? And, we were told, actually, we don't really have a whole lot in common with them. There's ways in which, yes, but we just kind of like don't really interact all that much. And so, when people say like, are they like kind of really essential part of your identity? We're like, maybe like, there was some ambivalence to an extent, more I think than certainly I expected. And as like anything, as the border becomes more and more difficult to cross, people do drift apart. So, in terms of families visiting, extended parts of their family, as that reduces, for sure, it's going to create more and more kind of divisions in terms of identity to some extent. So, that's, in that way, people ask, like, does the border work? Well, the border never works in terms of, like, being, like, an absolute wall and stopping everything. No, that's, like, no border works that way. But it can work in terms of, if you make it hard enough for people to interact, they will grow apart. And there's ways in which that's happening. Nogales is trying to challenge, for example, the placement of this razor wire in their city. They've had the wall there for a long time, and they've had to cope with that. However, there's still been a fair bit of circulation across that border. But between that and the overall militarization, it's definitely, I think they recognize that it will cause them to drift apart. It's like one room where I could make a joke about Phil Donahue and people would get it.
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned as part of your title, and the sacred. And I'd like you to expand upon that, please.
Right. So the first, for me, part of that has to do with King's mission, and that, it's borders are not about what we see. To me. And that's why that struggle is a kind of never-ending one, because that's not where the struggle is really happening. The struggle's happening where we don't see it. And, in a way related to the earlier question, to me, the sacred, or maybe the opposite to an extent, the denial of the sacred, is to take away the capacity for families to live together, for people to move, and just simply move. I mean, children are taken away from parents. That has nothing to do with a wall. It has to do with a certain way in which that space has come to be managed. And it's a space, unfortunately, that's kind of overwrought with death. I mean, a lot of people have died in this space. And so it's almost the denial of the sacred. To me, what's sacred is our challenge to it. The need to say that one of the questions that always comes up, well, why is this so different than the Canada-US border? Well, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why that might be. But I think one of the key reasons is there's a way in which we're willing to see the other in a way that's far more hospitable than is going on that border. We put a lot of impediments and we put a lot of lenses in our eyes that make us see that other as different in a way that we are concerned, we think they're nefarious, we have suspicions, and we simply don't see them as us. And to take students there and have them interact, that's sort of, in a way, that's the difference to doing the book learning, is to sit there together and eat and share day-to-day stories and realize we're all just part of the human family. And something kind of devastating is going on here. And I mean, I don't think we should be okay with that. How we choose to act on that, I think, is up to us. But, what is more sacred than recognizing ourselves in the other, to an extent? And I think that's ultimately what challenging a kind of, for lack of a better word, bordering politics or border practices or what have you is all about, is to recognize. I mean, last year I had the opportunity to go to Italy with students and we talked about the migration crisis there. At the end of the day, it's the same thing. Why is it that we can look at, why do people get into a dinghy that's full of holes to cross the Mediterranean, knowing full well that many of them won't make it? Why can't we see those as part of our family? And I think that's, the desert, unfortunately, is it's the same space where that's what we need to see. That's the ultimate way to challenge that. You say you just simply can't do that because these are not others. So I don't know if that's my answer.
First, I just really liked your point about Nixon's the first lady,
Right.
the wife. Because when I was in Notre Dame this past weekend, a group from Notre Dame University went to Arizona in January, I think, and I asked them, even a Republican president like Reagan created an amnesty for 3 million illegal migrants, but then we are facing the same area of Trump, who obviously doesn't care. But my question is pertaining to Operation Streamline, and obviously the unconstitutionality of that. But I'm wondering if in your research, if you've come across the deportation process back to Mexico and how the border has been a strategic part in that, because even if migrants aren't from Mexico, they'll just deport them back there anyway, even if they're from Honduras or whatever. And I know through the policy prevention through deterrence, to strategically place migrants away from easy border entry, and in places like the Sonoran Desert. I'm not sure if you can elaborate further, like if you've learned more through your research about the strategics of the border in deportation.
Right, that's a big question.
Yeah. Sorry.
So the first thing is Operation Streamline. So the earlier question asked, is there something we would change at the trip? So we didn't get a chance to go to see Operation Streamline. It's one of the only closed court proceedings in the United States where they managed to process sometimes between 80 and 100 migrants within an hour. Basically, it's just a kind of guilty, not guilty. It's very rapid. You're right. It certainly doesn't fit into the constitutional dream of the United States in any way. And it leads to really increased levels of incarceration. So, a lot of people are incarcerated for varying lengths of time, sort of 3 to 6 months is often the case, and then deported in a lot of cases. And so then there's the deportation dynamic. And you're also right that a significant amount, in fact, increasingly the larger amount of migrants are not from Mexico. They've come through Mexico, but they're from other countries in Central and South America. However, they are deported into Mexico. So, like, there's a whole variety of, like, problems that arise from this. I mean, Operation Streamline, I mean, there's nothing, like, there's no debate there. That's just clearly not okay to march 80 people up in front of a judge and in an hour just go through what is allegedly a legal process. That's not. I have in the past visited a shelter on the Nogales side, and, like, we couldn't go there because they were actually too busy. And they deal with those who have recently been deported. So something that happens is often the U.S. policy is to not necessarily deport someone at the port of entry near which they were captured. So someone might have been caught in the desert somewhere, and they'll get deported a vast distance from there. And so there's a lot of, like, you're disoriented, you've lost your group, you have to figure out where you are again. And in many cases, those individuals, will try to get back because if they're from Guatemala, like, they've walked all that far, they're probably not just going to walk back home. So, I mean, there's that dynamic there. Deportations were actually the highest under Obama. He was, not only known as the drone president, but also the deportation president. So that has actually reduced. It's partly reduced because, again, as much as, like, from far away the story is that there's a huge crisis, actual migrant numbers have declined. They're actually lower in the past 2 or 3 years than they have been. So, the other question in terms of the desert, again, deaths have declined, I think, because movements have declined. But that remains a strategy of Border Patrol to, they set up checkpoints in Arizona. It's done all throughout the United States, but Arizona has more than any other state by a significant amount, where it's basically like a border crossing, just what you would expect at a port of entry, but you're not at the border. You're inside the state. And the reason they do this is to shift the patterns of migration, because, of course, people learn where those checkpoints are, and so they go different routes. And they've put them in places that the routes that people would then take are far more dangerous. So one of them, for example, is through the Huachaca Mountains, which is, a really high mountain range, so it's really difficult terrain to get through. And so they continue very much to use the desert and the natural landscape as a deterrence in that way. None of those policies have changed. Arguably, they won't in that area because the whole, like, building a wall cannot happen in those incredibly complex kind of geographic spaces either. And so if you want to, quote unquote, kind of stop the migration, then that's the kind of approach you will take as well. So I know that only answers part of your question, but I can answer more of it another time. I know that.
So when you say people on both sides are telling you there's no crisis here, do you think they're meaning there's no migrant crisis, or there's no wall crisis, or both?
Part of me wants to say, like, the students should answer, but no, I won't do that. I think the first point they're saying is the migrant crisis. So, my colleagues and their Javier, he's, like, yelling at one point when we're sending, where's the caravan? Like, it's almost like a joke there because it's simply not happening there. Yes, there are we saw migrants being turned back at the border and going back into the Mexican port of entry facility. It's not as if there's no migration, there is. But I think their first point is that's not a crisis. I would say in general, they are not saying there's not a border crisis. I would say that they would simply say, like, look around. Like, there is a crisis with that. I think it's now 7 different jurisdictions in southern Arizona are going to court to try and get the razor wire removed in Nogales because they perceive that as a crisis. Like, this is our town. We don't want layers and layers of razor wire running through our town. So in that way, that is a crisis. If you see the numbers of, the largest law enforcement agency in the United States is Customs and Border Protection. That's significant. If you've been to the US, there's a lot of different law enforcement agencies in the US. But that's the largest, and so simply their presence, which is problematic in a lot of ways, particularly on indigenous land. There's some really serious problems with their interaction with the population. And so that is also a kind of crisis. We got to spend some time in a high school classroom on the reservation. And so when we had walked along the border there, that was one of the things on the trip. Like, that, it wasn't really supposed to happen that way. So we were kind of walking in the desert along the border, like, kind of lost. Not really. A little bit lost. And like, students were like, this is like in Uriah's Devil's Highway. And like, we saw like broken water bottles and things. And like, I didn't feel a cause to panic quite yet, but it was a bit of an unplanned, unscripted part of the trip. And there we were out there. We saw 2 Border Patrol vehicles, and they saw us coming, and they got in their vehicles and drove away. So we're in the high school classroom that afternoon on the reservation, and we tell that story. There's like they almost erupted into like laughter and things, and like gasping, and like just thought this was so incredibly absurd. And so the teacher, she asked, how many of you have been stopped by Border Patrol? And everyone's hand went up. How many of you have been aggressively questioned by Border Patrol? Everyone's hand went up. How many of you had a gun pulled on you by Border Patrol? Probably like at least a third to a half of the students' hands went up. In a high school classroom. Like, I think all of our mouths were gaping open. So that, they would all say, like, that's a crisis, for sure. All those things are crisis. They do have issues, particularly on the reservation, because in the same way that, there's a kind of management of the border that's going on there, there's like kind of different jurisdictions and whose space is it, people who are trafficking humans also know about that, or trafficking contraband. And so, yeah, there's issues. People living along the border, they're not happy to have like people sleeping on their step when they wake up in the morning. So there are issues, but I think the crisis, you're right, they would not say that there's no crisis in terms of what we might say is the mismanagement of the border.
Sonia, your life journey in terms of the Berlin Wall, Ireland, and now the wall in Mexico was quite insightful for me in terms of what the impact of the wall is for families and the like. Those walls are created by political divides that exist, and there seems to be an increasing polarization of views in the United States, Canada, and Europe. What impact do you see that social media has had in the escalation of the separation of countries and ideologies?
That's a complex question. So I'm like, that's not my kind of expert area, but I'll give you my answer to that. I think so there's a lot of great things that social media does, and so just in the same way as I allow students to use computers in my classroom, I wouldn't say they should never use them because there's good uses. Some of them are surfing the internet while I'm talking. So like both of those things happen at the same time. Social media has some useful applications. It can also, though, I think, allow us to continually hear what we want to hear. And so there's a kind of like amplification of confirming things we already believe in. If we don't want to hear things that trouble us, that challenge our understanding of the world, that make us think, potentially just make us think a little harder, about situations, we can very easily turn that off completely and actually fill the void with something else that continues to give us the kinds of stories that we want to have. And so I think that has helped contribute for sure to the kind of polarization that we're seeing, and that leads to kind of an extremism as well. You know, there's all kinds of, particularly the US, they've been quite good at doing these studies where you'll go to some tiny town in Wisconsin and literally within hours of the kind of talking points on a major news outlet about, you know, their local Republican candidate, everyone in that cafe will be repeating that. And I think like social media is key for that. It's also like, you know, in terms of like academics, we're about complicating things. So, you know, we tend not to be like, who can write the shortest book about borders? That's sort of not our thing. And so, you know, who can say, you know, in 140 or 280 characters something useful about this? Well, I think we would recognize that a lot of these issues, you actually can't do that. And so in an age where a president is kind of the predominant form of communication is through something like Twitter, I mean, it's hard not to just say that it's simply a dumbing down of some complex issues into sound bites that are easy to repeat, are easy to kind of grab hold of. And so in that way, I think it's just like it's a loudspeaker, it's an amplifier for a lot of that. So as I say, I mean, it's not really my specific field of study, but that's my take on social media. I mean, having said that, like I have colleagues who, you know, post all kinds of stories and things that are useful, and there's ways we communicate with the students and we pass them information and stories and through social media. So it's also allowed us to get even more information out there. So it's, you know, it's one of those things. It's not all bad, but it certainly has some pretty negative uses.
In your course, it seems that you focus on physical walls and faraway places. But I'm wondering whether in your course you also explore the barriers that exist within our own city that are not necessarily physical, but barriers between poverty and wealth, capability and non-capability, people that are smart, people that are not smart. I mean, to focus the problem far away, I think ignores the problems that exist in our own city. I'm wondering whether your course looks at that.
So this particular course doesn't. So the course is called American Borders and Borderlands. It's about the border in the American Southwest. So for sure, it absolutely doesn't do that. Do I do that like more generally? Do I do that in like survey courses and things? For sure. I mean, students who've had me in other classes hear me talk about local examples all the time about ways in which we see kind of invisible walls of segregation in our city. We see, I mean, you can trace this in all kinds of ways in terms of, I mean, what grocery stores sell alcohol or not. You plot that on a map in London, you realize there's a notion that certain people ought to have access and others can't be trusted. And that has a whole variety of assumptions about socioeconomics, about race, and so on. It's not to say that all of those things are not going on at these borders. They are. Oftentimes, those kind of physical barriers are simply reinforcing those kinds of cleavages that we want to make or political actors wish to make. And so this is a way that they can kind of reinforce them. Because there's definitely socioeconomic divide across the US-Mexico border. There's definitely a kind of racial divide in terms, I mean, President Trump's discourse certainly underscores that. So it's not as if we don't see all those things, but you're absolutely right. A lot of times, I mean, in Belfast, depending on how someone pronounced their H, was a border. So you'd walk in a pub and you could hear people speaking, oh, this is a kind of a paramilitary Protestant place. So I mean, that's a border. That's a pretty clear border. And again, in a lot of those situations, it's because all of these different cleavages become mutually reinforcing, and it's not accidental. It's ways, you know, there's ways in which that gets promoted often, in terms of the socioeconomics, in terms, you're right, in terms of education and access and all these things. So as I say, in this particular course, I don't talk about it, but I would say, like, and my colleagues included, we talk about those things in our classes, absolutely. You know, and some of the, I mean, not in this course, but when I'm teaching the border course just as a course, because we have more class time, we do read more broadly in terms of like bordering kind of practices that definitely happen within cities. Yeah, and unfortunately, I would agree with you that we see that a lot in our city.
I was wondering if you had any insights on the border in the West Bank, the wall in the West Bank. How would you compare it to Berlin, et cetera?
This is where, so like I use Twitter, I use other forms of social media, so I'll entertain that question. This is where I'll like pull the parachute and say like, I feel like I'm out of my depth to talk about that. I mean, you know, the limited amount I know about that space, I mean, the wall is trying to do the same kinds of things that it's doing everywhere. But I can't give you any special insight there because like part of the issue is like all these situations are radically different. I mean, yes, there's things we can learn from them, but they're radically different, and there's some really different issues on the ground there that I just wouldn't be comfortable kind of commenting on.
Fair enough. We actually went to Arizona a
Right.
few years ago and didn't have that sense at all about Nogales. Why would that be? We kind of just walked from Nogales, Arizona into Nogales, Mexico, and it was like, where's the problem? Where's the wall? Where's,
Right.
you know, that was going that way. And then, of course, and then we had no trouble coming back either, on foot.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think as I said, this has changed dramatically in a short amount of time. If you would ask people in Tucson, for example, where do you go to the dentist, you would find the majority would go to Nogales, Mexico, for their dental work. A lot of people from Nogales, Mexico would come, you know, it's not different than Canadians. Like, go to a big box shopping mall south of Tucson, it's full of Mexican license plates. They want to go shopping, just like Canadians do in the US. So all of those kind of flows have always been there, but they are being made more difficult. And you know, having National Guard there, having razor wire there, actually, you know, it does also lengthen the line. The US side has clamped down. So the movement across the US border there, back into the US, has slowed. So that makes people recalculate and say, well, I don't know, like, is it still worth it to go down for that reason? The American side, I mean, the students saw this, that there's really like economic depression going on the American side because of the lack of people coming across to shop, simply. So it is being made more inconvenient, for sure. And I agree, since just a couple of years ago.
So we have time for a couple more questions.
It's not overrun in Nogales. So one of the interesting things, so I mean, there is a kind of caravan. The majority have gone to the Tijuana, San Diego crossing. Most of the people who have kind of focused on the Nogales crossing are actually basically the LGBTQ community, who have basically gone there for whatever reasons. They've believed that would be a better crossing for them, and so, but they're dealing with that there. There's no overrun processing centers and so on there. For the most part, I mean, the U.S. policy has been to try and thwart people from actually claiming asylum. And so that's why, you know, by hardening those borders, by shifting people out into the desert and so on, then you're simply like crossing illegally. And so it can be something that can simply result in legal process and incarceration. So there's been a move to try and, they're not saying like, we have centers here for this kind of process to occur in that kind of managed way. But certainly in Nogales, no, there's not a kind of overrun on those resources at all.
Hi, me again. So as a classic SJP student, I'm wondering what kind of actions can be taken. So what advice would you give, or what ways in which would you suggest to advocate against these border practices? Is it to be more politically engaged, or does it look like participating in activist groups like No One Is Illegal? So as an academic and working within the confines of a university, what would you say to students who understand the problems of the border and ways to engage with it that actively combat it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think, like, so the first point is, it's a classic academic line, but I'm going to say it anyways, that, like, having experienced something like that and knowing what you know, you need to share that, that really is doing something. We all know that kind of conversations that we have, we hear things that we're like, it's not really like that. Don't hesitate. Engage. I have a sticker on my door. It says, silence is violence. Like, you've got to speak up. And so that's important. But yes, some of the work done by NGOs there is worthwhile work, for sure. One of the reasons I'm like hesitant is that currently the Border Patrol are being really punitive towards people who are involved in some of those things. And so I wouldn't advocate people doing things that could result in them getting arrested, which is happening. So, there are people who leave water out in the desert, who leave backpacks full of socks, because if you've walked from Guatemala, your socks have pretty well worn out, probably multiple times. So, water, things like that. Those projects, which have been done for many years there, some of the people involved in those things are starting to get encounter a lot of problems from Border Patrol. So that's my only hesitation, but otherwise I think that's important work. The Border Patrol as an institution has set up these beacons, and they're trying to say if people are lost, they should go to them and hit the button and the light goes on and you can be found. There's, I don't know how much that institution is changing and that it's really doing that. But certainly there's other ways to we're not Americans, so there's ways we can't pressure political actors, but there are ways that we could. And, getting our voices out there. The Colibri Project there. So the Colibri Project is a local group that basically works with found human remains and does DNA analysis on them, and then tries to connect with people. They never have enough people working for them. They always need more resources and more people. So a lot of these groups are like that, and to a large extent, that's hard work emotionally, but it's not dangerous work in that way, and it's really important work. If you've lost a loved one and you have no closure, that's a pretty important bit of work to do to be able to provide a family with that. So those are all things that are going on in that space, in addition to the kind of maybe more celebrated activist things where people are doing art installations and people are protesting at Operation Streamline regularly, and all those kinds of actions. Yeah, they do. While we were there was actually a large protest because a company from Tucson was given the contract to build the new fence in El Paso, running between El Paso and Juarez. So, something that also shows this borderland is kind of a mess in that way. In the one space, people are saying there's no crisis, we need to stop this. Meanwhile, there's actually companies that are profiting off of this in another border space down the road. So all those actions are useful. But I do think some of those NGOs, their work is good. I would just say I would be cautious because of current policies.
Okay, one more.
It's quite obvious now, your topic for tonight that you've chosen. Question one, could you say why you chose this particular border to speak about? Is it just because it's a recent experience and something you touched upon in your course? And also you mentioned your trip to Italy a couple years back. What are your personal views and opinions on what you encountered there, and also the native Italians that you spoke with? What were their personal views on the presumed crisis that they're experiencing?
Okay. So I mean, why I spoke about this, yeah, partly I think it was a good fit to talk about this course. I've been going to Arizona and researching this border since 2008, and I spent my sabbatical there in 2014. So I'm also like, I love the place. And so, you know, if I get a chance to talk about something, I'd probably pick that. And, you know, like it looks great in pictures. It's got all the things and the complexities and there's just something there that got into me. And so that's part of, yeah, it's partly the class, but it's not only the class. It's bigger than that. It's been a bigger part of my research for a longer time. The Italy question's a bigger one. So our work there is at Rondine, which is a center for peace that has been recognized by the United Nations. And there are students there who are doing graduate work from deeply divided societies around the world. So Israel, Palestine, Azerbaijan, South Africa, all over the place. Our students interact with them, but we also talk about contemporary issues, a big one being the migration crisis going on in terms of the numbers of migrants coming from Syria and North Africa into Italy. And Italy's kind of swing politically towards the right to being kind of more closed in terms of its border to that. So I preface everything with that because most of the Italians I spoke to when I'm there are people who either know about the center or are affiliated with the center and tend to have a pretty, you know, critical perspective on the government's strategies towards the dealing with migrants. In terms of like the newspapers and the popular media, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, the whole shift in government is likely a result in some ways to hostility towards migrants coming in. And, you know, like in a lot of places, in large urban centers, it's easier to kind of take those people in because not everybody notices them all the time. Whereas in smaller centers, you see issues arise more. And we are in a smaller center when we're there. It's in Arezzo, so it's a smaller town. And they have their own stories in terms of problems arising with the local population in terms of just the kind of lack of hospitality, to just sort of use a broad kind of philosophical term really to describe it. But like that's also what complicates that is it's also part of a European Union architecture that, you know, it's on the frontier of the EU, which is trying to manage an open zone inside and what some would say is a fortress outside, and it's part of the fortress walls, if you will. And so it's not about being hospitable and letting people in that way. You know, Germany's the outlier in that sense.
So just to offer a word of thanks, thank you. It's clear that we have a great gift in having you here at King's. That you're an engaging teacher, instructor, and professor, and so thank you so much for sharing that. One of the things that we listened to last week when Kids for Peace was here was this sense of the other. And sometimes distance is good, and always we need to get closer as well, right? So this sense of how do we make sense of who is the other and how close are we really is really a contemporary crisis of faith that we need to grapple with as well. So thank you from a political perspective and also from a faith perspective. Thank you for your time with us tonight. Please join me in thanking Professor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I do have just a couple of housekeeping things. So this is our last lecture for this year. We do look forward, though, to 2019. September 19th of 2019, we will welcome Senator Murray Sinclair, who is going to give us an update and some thoughts on the Truth and Reconciliation process. So please mark that on your calendars. That's about the only one I can confirm absolutely for you at this point for next year. But we're looking forward to putting on another great series next year. I have two public service announcements, okay? So beyond that. One is that I don't know if people are aware, but I'll give one more plug for the London Interfaith Peace Camp, which is something that is run here at King's through a community partnership. If anyone, especially students, are interested in getting engaged in that, one more plug for that. They're always looking for leadership. Lastly, I've been asked to announce, so we have a speaker, there is the group called London Grands. Do people know about London Grands? If you don't, you should. But the London Grands are going to host Elena Landsberg-Lewis, who is the former executive director of Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign of the Stephen Lewis Foundation. And so Elena is also the daughter of Stephen Lewis, and she and her father have a strong attachment to Africa. But she will be here speaking at 7 o'clock on May 29th, if you want to. So just a first plug for that. We'll distribute some advertising for them when it comes out. But I think I will leave it at that for this time. But if you want to mark your calendar for another good opportunity to engage, May 29th. Thank you for coming. I hope everyone has a great evening and continue with your coursework. Great to see so many students here tonight and clearly representing. So thank you so much. Please join me one more time.